Should you play Resident Evil 5 in 2026? Well, if you're someone like me, then you have no idea. I recently have finished playing Resident Evil 4 Remake, and now it was time for me to finally play this for the first time. I hear so much good and bad about this game, but regardless of what is said, it seems to change depending on the person. So I'm glad I was finally able to dive in and experience this. But let's discuss more about this game in further detail to see if it's worth your time. So going straight to the gameplay, this is where I was kinda torn on. When I first started playing it, I immediately noticed how bad the controls were. It's weird because the gameplay itself in regards to what you're doing is the same as RE4, but it's how you actually do it is where it differs. You're able to sort of sprint forward, but instead of holding down the analog stick, you have to hold down A or X and then move it in that direction. This isn't the biggest flaw, but definitely annoying considering how games are designed today, but you can get used to that. What's even worse is the camera. This camera reminded me of the older Devil May Cry game's camera system. If you played them, then you know exactly what I mean. In RE5, you have the ability to do a quick turn, which is a 180-degree change of camera angle at the press of a button. This is cool, but it would have been so much better if you could just turn the camera to do the same thing. You can move the camera, but not like you would on the quick turn. Then there's many times that the camera just spazzes out when a lot of stuff is going on. Whenever there is an explosion or a bunch of enemies littered around, the camera can't focus until you aim. Or if you're fighting a boss that is very tall, then the camera doesn't move to adjust to its height until you aim once again. It's almost as if it was designed to be a fixed, free hybrid camera style because you can move it, but not to the degree that you would like. I died multiple times because I simply couldn't turn the camera in the manner that I intended. To put it simply, if you want to see something at the perfect angle, you're gonna have to aim. There really isn't any other choice. When it comes to the combat, it's really fun, but what happened to me was that I was trying to do things fast, sort of at the same pace I did them in RE4, and I just couldn't. Maybe it's because I came off a recent game with that remake versus this, which is an older title, but I ran into this over the course of my entire playthrough. So many times I would want to move a certain way, sprint at this particular time, change to this weapon, and I failed miserably trying to do so. This would result in me either dying, missing the shot, or taking major damage simply because I failed at doing something. Of course, you could chalk this up as a skill issue, but this is what happened. It's like all the mechanics of the previous game were there, but the fluidity of it wasn't. And it's the lack of that fluidity which is what caused me to have a bit of the trouble I had here and there. Couple that with the movement, and this gameplay was definitely different for sure. Everything about the movement feels 7th generation, with you having many QTEs and having to press a button to perform certain actions. What I thought was really cool was that you had a bit more moves to perform when fighting the enemies than compared to Leon. Leon just had the kick and the suplex, but with Chris you were able to punch, kick, and do other actions. This made the combat feel like a small evolution from what it was before, but with the issues that I had earlier, this kind of nullified how fun it was to execute these combos. Normally you would want to shoot and sprint forward quickly to do one of these melee moves, but with everything being so static and slow, I ended up doing these whenever it was convenient, not when it would work the best. So if I were to shoot an enemy and I just so happened to be near them, only then would I try to melee them because I was just standing right there. This ended up being how I approached the entire game. Everything that I did, every action I took, was that it was the easiest thing to do, not the most efficient or optimal. By playing the game like this, I was able to adapt to the controls and movement to make my experience so much better. Now, as much as I have talked about not liking the controls and movement, the gameplay itself is still addicting as it's ever been. You're still running around in a third-person perspective, killing a bunch of Majani alongside other creatures in different areas. If you liked any of the Resident Evil games that came before this, then you'll enjoy the gameplay loop of 5 for sure. The newest feature is that you have an actual partner named Sheva who helps you during the combat. She can do pretty much anything you can. Hold weapons and items, give them to you, use them, kill enemies, and get to hard to reach places. In all honesty, I really liked having a partner during these encounters. It definitely helped. However, the AI could have been better. There were many times where Sheva wouldn't use the item she had to kill or heal herself, resulting in her dying or getting stunned. Then she would sort of slowly drift away when I would start sprinting towards another area. Like if I went right, she would take a while to eventually follow me. It wasn't instant like you would think it would be. I can only imagine how frustrating it would be on the harder difficulties because she isn't nearly as responsive as you would like. It's not like she doesn't do anything at all, but many times you'll find yourself hoping that she does one thing only for her to not perform that specific action. I think if the AI was better with Sheva, then this could have made a huge difference as the game went on. Thankfully though, she's not as bad as Ashley because Ashley was literally no help whatsoever. When killing the Majani, you had a slew of ways you could do it. Melee them to death with blunt weapons, shoot them with a pistol, shotguns, and machine guns, or blow them up with a grenade launcher. That's the thing I love about Resident Evil is that there's no right way to approach every combat scenario. While one person may shoot them with a pistol, another may use grenades, then the machine gun. It's great when you truly understand the enemy types and what works best on them versus the others. RE5 continues that trend in every encounter. encounter. Yes, the issues I mentioned earlier still persist, but if you played a previous RE game, then you kinda know how all this works, so you'll eventually adjust. I loved how you would get swarmed by a bunch of different enemies too. It was never as simple as just a 1v1 fight, unless it was a boss. The Majani are very similar to the Ganados if I'm being honest. They're still villagers infected by the Plaga's parasite and act the same way as the Ganados did before. They charge at you with their weapons, shoot you from a distance, and have brutes that can slam you at a moment's notice. It's like I said earlier, there's a lot of similarities between this game and RE4. I just think everything was done a bit better in that game. Maybe if I had played enough of the original RE4, then I would see how RE5's gameplay is superior, but that just isn't the case. Another thing I wanted to speak on was the inventory system. At its core, it's still the same from before, but it does lack a bit of that special feel without having a merchant. I get it, we don't need every RE game to have a merchant because it would get redundant, but I think something similar would have been cool. I still liked how you were able to find treasures and then sell them for money once you get access to your inventory. It was weird not being able to inlay gemstones into the treasures, but instead just sell them on their own. I was so used to being able to combine those diamonds with the crowns that not being able to do so messed with my brain. Just like a lot of other things in the game, the fluidity of the inventory system just wasn't there. I can't put my finger on it, but using this just felt slow. When I'm in the middle of a game and I want to switch to something that isn't registered as a shortcut, it felt like it took forever. The shortcuts worked really well as I could access everything quickly, but if I wanted something that wasn't a shortcut, I had a hard time finding it on the fly, especially when there was a lot of enemies around me at that moment. I did like how you could swap items with Sheva and give her things that you didn't have the space for. There were many times I would run out of space and I'd have her hoard all the items I didn't want. The only problem with that is that she would never use them. So for example, let's say I give her 3 fire grenades, right? Instead of her eventually using them when we entered combat. That was the same no matter the item. The only thing she seemed to want to use is the healing items like herbs and first aid sprays. Nonetheless, I thought that the inventory system worked, but it just didn't flow as nicely as it did in RE4. Regarding the boss fights, I thought these were really cool. The biggest difference is that they really went in on the size of the creatures this time around. In most of the boss fights, what you're fighting is very large in size and takes up most of the screen. Seeing either the Plagas or Ouroboros manifest inside people and turn them into these giant monsters never gets old. Speaking on the mechanics of these fights, they're about what you would expect. Either shoot the weak points, perform an action to expose the weak points, or trap them in an area. The main issue with these fights is that it's not always obvious what you should do mid-fight. There was many times toward the latter stages of the game where I found myself like, how do I kill this guy? Because literally nothing seemed to work. This isn't really a critique, just something worth mentioning as it reminded me of when this game released. Back in the PS2 and PS3 gen, there wasn't as much hand-holding, and you had to pick up on context clues in order to figure out what to do. So if you find yourself like me and didn't understand something, just think a bit about it before looking it up. Lastly, I wanted to mention the lack of puzzles. This game really went away from the puzzles, which took me by surprise. This isn't to say that there isn't any puzzles, but they're not in the game as much as you would think. The ones that do exist aren't difficult to solve, as the hardest puzzle was this one inside the cave. We have to move these mirrors to reflect the beam. Outside of that, most of them were just finding a key or inputting a seal into a door to keep moving forward. For someone like me who doesn't have a high tolerance for puzzles, I'm not complaining, but I do think it's weird considering RE is known for having a bunch of them. In its entirety, the gameplay for Resident Evil 5 is still really fun. At its core, you can see it took the majority of what was in RE4 and tried making it a bit better. I think comparing it to the OG RE4, it might have been better, but when you look at the remake, it doesn't compare. I think if this game got a remake, then all the issues I mentioned wouldn't exist, and it would be so much fun because the framework is there for sure. What surprised me the most is that the story for this is actually pretty good. Personally, I always enjoyed the stories for these Resident Evil games, but going into this, I didn't think much was really going to happen. However, the story and lore for this game is a lot more important than you would think. You play as Chris Redfield as he is sent to Africa to stop a bioorganic weapon from being sold on the black market. However, things don't go as planned and things get crazy really fast. I thought it was cool to go to Africa as that was an area we hadn't gone to in the series yet. The environments and layout all were about what you would expect if a parasite had taken over the villages within Africa. When I first saw the gators in the water, I was shook. I knew that there were large bodies of water in these areas, but the last thing I was expecting to see in this game was some gators. Of course, I knew dogs and chickens would probably be in this, but gators? That's a nice touch. This just added to the overall atmosphere and made it feel like you really were in Africa. As the story went on, you saw the impact the parasite had on the villagers. Seeing them turn into these crazy versions of themselves, cause others to mutate, and of course, wreak havoc across those areas. When I first met Sheva, I didn't think I would care much about her, maybe because I was fresh off off of escorting Ashley from RE4, so I wasn't too keen on having a partner. However, by the time I got to the end stages of the game, I ended up liking having her by my side and wanted her up and ready to fight at all times. The whole dynamic of their partnership was always a reminder of the partner that he had lost before, who I'll try not to spoil, and how this time around things would be different. Over the course of this story, Chris always mentions what had happened at the mansion, and the impact of that moment is felt throughout the entire story of RE5. I think what cannot be understated is how important it is to read all the files and documents in this game. Normally these always provide some sort of information, but I think in this game they're more important than ever. They provide you with crucial details regarding the beginning of this entire situation, how these viruses came to be, who was responsible, why the steps were taken to create the viruses, etc. I guess I would say that the lore in this game is more substantial and valuable than in RE4, at least to me. There's a small cast of characters in this just like the others, but outside of Chris and Sheva, I wasn't too invested in any of them, outside of the main villain. He's just him. So the character interactions were cool, but I didn't find myself too into them. One thing I really enjoyed was how the main villain felt like this unstoppable force. Compared to other games, the villain definitely was a menace, but this time it felt as if we stood zero chance. This guy was out here doing Matrix moves and running like the Flash during some of the encounters. This just adds to the horror element within Resident Evil. For a game that isn't scary at all, there's a small layer of tension that is created when you're fighting a guy who seems like he can't be defeated. By the time you roll credits, you'll probably like this villain as much as I did. The story for Resident Evil 5 doesn't do anything new. It doesn't move the needle and push the series into uncharted territory, but what it does do is create an entertaining and thrilling story, while providing us with the lore to help connect more dots within this larger universe. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, they made this man Chris a literal superhero, with him punching a boulder like he's inside the boxing gym. Just typical RE ridiculousness. If you get the gold edition of this game, you'll get access to 2 DLC chapters called Lost in Nightmares and Desperate Escape. Speaking about each of these campaigns, they're both fun for different reasons. The Lost in Nightmares campaign takes you through the flashback of what happened the night Chris lost his partner that's referenced throughout the base game. Desperate Escape has you playing with that partner as you and someone else attempt to help Chris and Sheva defeat the main villain. Even though they're both DLCs, their vibes are completely different. Starting with Lost in Nightmares, this is more about the atmosphere, as a lot of it is you just walking around, unlocking doors with minimal combat. There are some encounters, but it's clear that it's not the main focus. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a nice switch up to the normal gameplay flow, because it was cool to sort of vibe out and just explore the mansion. The enemies you do face aren't too difficult to kill, but you may find the lack of ammo being the biggest issue, as they're kinda spongy. Your safest bet might be to draw them away until you find what you're looking for. Once you get through the doors, you'll eventually find yourself replaying the moment that we see during the flashbacks over the main story. This DLC is chill and just a cool way to experience that flashback, even if it's not overly fleshed out. Desperate Escape is the opposite, where it's all gas, no brakes. Right from the start, you go around killing a bunch of Majani, as it seems like endless waves of them spawn in. You're shooting them as you try to progress forward to help Cress and Sheva during the final encounter. It kinda reminds you of the Separate Ways DLC with Ada, where at the end she was going through a bunch of enemies in an attempt to reach Leon to help him with Sadler. This runs the same way, with you having to kill brutes and blast open doors to try to reach a helicopter. There isn't too much to say about this mode because it really is that simple. You're with Josh and the two of you have to fight through waves of enemies. That's literally it. Just like in Lost Nightmares, it's a nice switch up, but for the fact that the action is turned up all the way. It kinda reminds you of Mercenaries, but not to the same degree. Fighting a bunch of enemies in Resident Evil never gets old, especially when you're given fun weapons like machine guns to use when killing them. Regardless of which expansion you decide to play, I'd say both are good enough to make them worth purchasing. They add a little bit of story to give you an incentive to finish them, and I think they serve as good content to look forward to after completing the main story. Overall, Resident Evil 5 is a fun game with issues that I think stem from the game's age. Coming from Resident Evil 4 Remake, where I was accustomed to that level of gameplay, it was definitely jarring to play something as dated as this. Even still, the foundation is there, and I think if this ended up being remade, then it would be really good. The story is interesting, gameplay is fun, and the environment could look amazing in current gen visuals. So to answer the question, should you play Resident Evil 5 in 2026? I would say, sure, why not? The game is worth your time, just make sure you get it on sale and don't have super high expectations, because it's a step down from 4 in my opinion. However, if you like Resident Evil, then there's no reason to not get this because it's still more of the same. If I had to give this game a score, I'd give it an 8. As I mentioned, there's a handful of issues with this game, but what it does right is keeping that same Resident Evil feel with the gameplay and story, and that's what carries this title. I'm looking forward to playing Resident Evil 6 for the first time next and seeing how bad that game is, because I've heard that game is what almost killed the series. What did you think about Resident Evil 5? Have you played this before, or are you hearing about this for the first time? Let me know in the comment section below, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to watch one of my other reviews right here.